So Gwen, when was the book actually published?
So the English version, the American version, sorry, the American version came out in early May, I think May 4th. And then the UK version just came out recently. It was released June
Oh,
28th.
really? Oh, yeah.
And we've sold to 12 countries.
That's great.
But I don't
Congratulations.
know when. I don't know when they come out. I don't know. Hi, Tom.
All right. Should we get started? I think it's 11.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, the bell just tolled here. I'll
Yeah.
stop. I'll stop.
For whom did the bell toll? That's what I want.
It's a different book.
Same time period. Well, more or less the same time period. So my name is Zack Rogow, and I'm so pleased to be in discussion today with Gwen Strauss about her new book, The Nine, which is a gripping and incredibly informative book about women in the resistance, and in particular, 9 women who escaped from a forced labor camp. And Gwen, for those of you who don't know her, is a multi-talented writer. She, of course, is a nonfiction writer. This is a book of nonfiction, but she's also a poet and a fiction writer and the author of an award-winning children's book, or co-author of an award-winning children's book. And in addition to all of that, she is the director of the Dora Maar Cultural Center in Ménèrbes, France, in the south of France, which is a sort of multi-winged cultural center that puts on all kinds of artistic events and also hosts artists to work on projects and scholars. So Gwen, it's so nice to be with you today and discussing your book.
Thank you, Zach. Thank you for suggesting we do this. I really appreciate it.
So I'm wondering if we can just start with a bit of an overview or introduction to the book. Tell us a little bit about the book and how you came to write it.
Okay. So the book, just really roughly, it's the story of an escape. My great aunt Hélène Podliaski told the story to me initially back in 2002, and it's basically the story of her and a group of 8 other women, 9 women in all, who escaped from a death march at the end of the war from their forced labor camp and traveled for 9 or 10 days across the front lines of the war in Germany in search of the US troops. So the actual book itself is the story of that escape. In a way, that's the structure of the story. But I also talk about each of those women they were all quite young. There were 6 French, 2 Dutch, and 1 Spanish. They were all in their 20s. Some of them had joined the resistance in their teens. They were resistance fighters. 2 of them were Jewish, though that was not why they were arrested. The Germans didn't know they were Jewish. They kept that hidden. And they were arrested at different times, but met each other basically in Ravensbrück, the second largest concentration camp after Auschwitz-Birkenau. They met each other there. They were selected for labor at Leipzig. They worked in Leipzig, and then they escaped together. So the book tells the story of that escape, tells the story of their past, and it also tells sort of what happened to them after the war. And the book also has another thread, which is a little bit my story of trying to figure out the story, the little meta part.
So tell us how you came to even know about this escape, because I think, what happened to a lot of the women or people in general who lived through the horrors of the Holocaust and World War II is that they coped with it by not talking about it. And so how did the story finally come to light?
Well, that's very true. The story was not really a story that was told. My great aunt Hélène Podliaski, who in the earlier screen share that I had, she was in the upper left-hand corner, maybe right-hand, I don't know, it switches around.
Anyway, upper left, yeah.
Upper left-hand corner. So she didn't talk about the story until she was near the end of her life. She told it to me in 2002, and I think at that time she was in her 80s or maybe 70s. And she hadn't talked about it. She had only spoken to probably her immediate family, but not her daughter. I think nearing the end of her life, she was ready in a way to talk about it. But a lot of the women didn't speak about these stories. They were sort of partly because it was a way to cope and you had to get on with life, but also there was a taboo about it and they were asked to keep quiet. One of the women, Zaza, Suzanne Maudet, wrote an account of their escape immediately after the war, which she tried to get published, and it was not published. It was refused, and so it was a little manuscript that circulated within her family, and then that story was published in 2004. So I came across that published book after talking to Hélène, and was sort of struck by the similarities of the two stories. I didn't know at the time that Hélène's nom de guerre was Christine. So when I first read the book, I wasn't sure if the woman who was called Christine in the book written by Zaza was actually my tante Hélène. But when I showed it to Hélène, she did confirm. She said, oh, yes, Zaza Suzanne was my friend. And so then we had two versions of the story. Then things kept continuing, and then there were these two wonderful Dutch filmmakers who made a documentary film about one of the Dutch women, Lon, who herself wrote a book, but near the end of her life. And they did a really great film about that. And so I saw that, where at the end of that film, Hélène and Lon are reunited after 60 years. So in the family, we knew about that film. And that led to finding more accounts, that led to finding Nicole Clarence's article that she wrote in Elle magazine. So slowly I realized that I had this story. I had several points of view of the story, not just the story told to me by Hélène, but then there was Zaza's point of view, and there was Lon's point of view, and there was Nicole's point of view. And it suddenly seemed to be, this, that's really interesting as a writer, when you have different points of view. Yeah, and I should say the name of the film, and it's on my website. There's a link to it on my website. The name of the film is Ontsnapt, which means escaped in Dutch, but it's subtitled in English, so it's really, I'm with it. Especially interesting for those who've read the book, because then you can see Lon and Hélène as elderly, near the end of their lives, and they're reuniting is quite moving. So I had this idea that I would just retrace the escape route, and I would write an essay or an article about it. I wasn't planning on writing a book. Then I went there with my daughter, and that led to me realizing I needed to learn so much more. I was really ignorant about the whole war, the camps and what happened to women in the camps and how that worked. And so I just sort of started to research and read other accounts, and it became huge. It took a long time.
The story that was most surprising to me was that in the women's concentration camp, Ravensbrück, which I didn't really know about, it was basically all women. Mm-hmm. There were acts of kindness that the women showed one another that helped them to, in some cases, survive this ordeal. Can you talk about that and what those, what you learned?
No, it's actually one of the great, I felt was one of the really important parts of the story for me. And discovering Ravensbrück was important. I mean, I sort of vaguely knew about Ravensbrück, but it was a camp built only for women, and it was a large camp. Any woman who was deported during the war either was sent basically to Auschwitz, where they were murdered, or they were sent to Ravensbrück. So most women who were deported at some point went through Ravensbrück. One could say it's kind of a common experience for the deported during the war. So it's really, to me, I started to realize it was sort of a central part of the story. And it was a complicated place. There were complicated hierarchies between the different groups. But what I was astonished by, and what I discovered in reading the different accounts, was the solidarity amongst the women, and how they helped each other out, and how these act of kindness at the risk of great peril sustained them. And simple things and complicated things, but one of the ones that really made me cry when I read about it was a thing called La Gamelle de la Solidarité, which was this ritual they had each night. They had an extra bowl, and they would pass it around, and each person who could would put a spoonful of their soup or their whatever in that bowl. Now, they're starving, they're already on complete starvation rations. So the idea that they would actually give some of what they were given, and that bowl would then be given to whoever they thought needed it the most that day. So maybe someone had been beaten that day, or someone had learned some terrible news that day, or whatever. That person would be given the gamelle, the extra food. I just thought that was intense, that they would be so generous at that moment, and one of the women who wrote about it, because I read about this in many accounts, but another woman, not in one of the 9, but her name was Hélène Bess. she wrote that charity is giving when you have something to give. Solidarity is giving when you have nothing to give. And I thought that was really beautiful. I found that the women tended to be more solidaire, more, they kind of formed families and they took care of each other. And that might account for why they lived longer than men did on average. They had a longer life expectancy.
There was a group of women that you just also described very movingly who were kind of dubbed the social workers.
Yes.
And
yes.
when there was someone who became so despairing
Yeah.
that she stopped washing herself, that she stopped taking care of her, the rags that they were reduced to.
Yeah.
There was this group. Well, tell us about that.
Yeah, and actually I read about that in Lise London's book. And Lise London's book was a great book to read because she talked about some of the women in my group. And yeah, so they had a thing called the social workers, and they point out that when, to commit suicide in the camp, people didn't commit suicide, they just had to stop trying. You know what I mean? You just had to put down you just had to give up and then you would die. So, they could sense when somebody in the group had stopped, had decided to not work anymore, not try anymore. And can you hear me, Zach?
Yes.
Okay, good. No, because I just had a little weird sound on my computer. I thought maybe I had gone mute. So the social workers would sweep into action, and they would first just try to encourage that person. They would try to remind them about their children, and then if that didn't work, they would try to give them some extra food, and then they would actually wash them, and they would, because one of the things that was difficult to do, but was really necessary to do, was to take care of the lice, try to wash yourselves as much as possible, to keep away the typhus and all the other diseases, So this group of women would do that. And the other thing that they would do, they had the social workers, and they also had sort of the, I don't know what they called it, but sort of like events planners, and they would do parties they would celebrate the birthdays of their children, or they would, they would decide that we're going to have a recital or a singing, or they would organize these moments of solidarity amongst the group. It was pretty.
Something I found very moving was that the women would recount to each other when they were in bed at night their favorite recipes. And they actually did they make a cookbook or something that they stitched?
Yeah, in fact, I guess, no, it's incredible. To me, this was another incredible part of the story. There was so much that I learned that was just deeply moving. This tradition of cookbooks. And in fact, Gigi had a cookbook, which her family showed me some of. And Nicole had a cookbook that she made. And these cookbooks, basically, they would recuperate little scraps of paper from the factory floor where they were working. They would sew them together, and then they would fill them with details of these recipes that they would recite at night, or during Sunday meals, they called it. They would sit around in a circle and they would recite a meal. And it was a way that they could kind of experience eating together, but obviously they were not eating anything. They were just imagining the food together. And they would go through the meal step by step, in each detail, like, you take an egg, and then you add cinnamon, and you can smell it in the house, and so that people could sort of be transported. And this became so popular that they would write the recipes down and pass them around so other blocks could recite the recipes. It was a kind of performance. And when I met Zinka's son, he was telling he and his mother, after the war, had become anorexic, and then he also was anorexic, so we were talking about that. But he said that it was ironic because his mother hated to eat, but apparently she won an award one night as best cook in Leipzig. But it's an interesting thing that's sort of counterintuitive. Starving people talk about food, and it somehow alleviates the immediacy of the hunger. And I think it helps to have a memory that is a little bit less. It's a wonderful meal is a memory we can share. It's a collective memory, and it's not too painful. They had to kind of avoid memories of their family that would hurt. So it was a way to have a memory and to share a memory without being too personal and going too close to the edge of their depression. Obviously, there was a kind of danger of thinking too much and going into the abyss, that they had to kind of guard themselves against. And the sharing was one of the ways.
You know, when I first heard about this story, I thought, how could 9 women walk across Germany in the middle of the Battle of the Bulge, I guess it was, or the final battle of World War II, and not be a very obvious target? Wouldn't it make more sense for them to split up? And what was so striking about the story was that their being together was part of what helped them to survive.
Yeah, I mean, it really was. They each had a role in the group. I think they each ended up finding their place in the way that they could support each other. And when one person was feeling weak and wobbly, the others would come to their aid. I think, in a way, they were hiding in plain sight. Like almost the fact that this group made it seem so audacious that they got away with it a little bit. That was part of their strategy. I mean, they tried different strategies as they went through the escape. One of them that they used pretty consistently was that Hélène, my aunt, and Lon would go ahead of the group and go and kind of scout out the situation and find a safe place for them. Because Hélène had traded a normal dress, so she had a kind of civilian clothes that she could wear. And they had kind of made something for Lon to look normal, somewhat normal. And the other thing was that both Lon and Hélène spoke perfect German without an accent, so they could pass as Germans, I think. And so that became kind of their MO. But the other thing that they did was they acted as if they should be there. They acted as if, you know, there was nothing wrong with this group of women walking like this. And it was so kind of, you know, it wasn't like 2 people furtively running. It was this group. And so I think at times that also worked in their favor. I mean, at times it didn't. At times they were very much in danger. But it's an interesting.
So can we back up a little bit and talk about the earlier part of the story? Because one of the things I learned in this book that I didn't know was the very key role that women played in the resistance to the Nazis. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that.
Yeah. And here again, this is something that's not, at least in France, not been talked about until quite recently, not since the last maybe 10 years. So a lot of women were involved in the resistance, a lot of young women. One of the reasons was that men in France during the war, very soon, were supposed to, there was a thing called the STO, the Service Travail Obligatoire. So the men were supposed to go work in Germany. If you were a young and healthy man, you had to volunteer to go work in the factories in Germany to support the Reich. And the idea was that they would release a French prisoner of war in exchange for your going to Germany. But that was all kind of, you know, not really happened. At first it was voluntary, then very soon became obligatory. So if you were a young man walking around, you would be stopped and questioned, what are you doing? Why aren't you at the STO? What do you know? So women had a kind of movement. Young women they could kind of pass, you know, they could go, they could be on a bike going to another town or whatever. Of course, it's also dangerous for those young women to be doing that because they could easily be taken advantage of. They were targets. They were quite vulnerable. But so many women worked as agents de liaison, where that was kind of the basic first step in the resistance, which is just kind of communicating from different groups and cells and passing messages and you know, liaising between the different poles of the network. And then many of the women in this group of 9 ended up rising in the ranks of the resistance. Hélène was very much a very important person in the resistance. So was Nicole. So was Jackie. So was Zinka, in fact. They each, but separately, they didn't know each other, but they each ended up playing kind of important roles in the resistance. And there were other women I learned about as I was studying this book who were very important, like Marie-Madeleine Fourcade, who had the largest network of agents in France, and that she was running that from the very start of the war, pretty much, and running it as a woman and hiding that she was a woman. She was in contact with the English, and they didn't know that she was a woman for most of that time. And they didn't know that she was pregnant for some of that time and giving birth to a child. I mean, she's kind of this extraordinary woman, amazing.
Can you say her name again or type?
Marie-Madeleine Fourcade. And she, you know, at the end of the war, when de Gaulle makes his list of I think it's 1,038 Compagnons de la Libération, those are the heroes of the resistance, 6 of them are women. 4 of them are already dead. He doesn't mention Mary Madeleine Fourcade. I mean, the kind of willingness to just erase that whole part of the story is kind of shocking. And even one of the Vernet, who was in charge of the resistance after the war, of recognizing the resistance after the war, said the women had to step back and let the men take the glory, because the men had been so badly humiliated. It would be further humiliation if the women got glory. So they were very clearly told just to shut up and not talk about it, and they wouldn't. And they basically did. The other thing is that when these women got to Paris, when they were liberated in 1945, Paris had already been liberated for a year. And people were they didn't want to talk about it. They didn't want to hear about it. It was like, I think it might have been like when Vietnam vets came home, or, it's kind of like, and it was shameful. Marriages were called off if a woman had been in the camp, that she was then tarnished goods. Some of the women even came back and were confused as, because some of them had the shaved heads from the concentration camps, and they were confused as being the, horizontal collaborators, which were these terrible, it was a terrible story. These young women in over 20,000, I think, in France, who different villages would choose these young women and sort of basically shave their heads and say that they had slept with Germans, and they were collaborators, and they would sometimes strip them and parade them through town and throw things at them. So women really took the brunt of the shame of the loss, and so I understand why these women, I don't know if I think I've gotten off the question, but these women didn't talk about their role in resistance very much. A lot of them really just decided to keep quiet about it.
So I understand that the book, The Nine, is going to be made into a TV series, or there has at least been a script written by the wonderful UK writer Ella Hickson.
Mm-hmm.
And can you talk about what that was like for you as the person who'd written the original book, collaborating or working with Ella Hickson on
I felt really lucky. I mean, Ella's great. She's an amazing writer, and it's really a different book that she's doing. A different story. Okay, so Ella is actually from the very beginning. I told Ella this story long before I had a book contract, and long before when I was just still trying to figure out how I was going to write it. I had a conversation with her one night, and she just was so enthusiastic about it. She really encouraged me, and she said, I want to pitch this as a TV series, and that kind of motivated me to get a book contract, to write a book proposal, to get a book contract. In a way, I feel really grateful to Ella, because she was kind of like the motivation behind me. And then once that happened, and she and I have been working quite closely to create the basic treatment, and but really she will be writing the screenplay. She has gone away from the story as a true. It's definitely based on the book, not really fact by fact. But what's been fun to work with her is to see how that mind is different. To do a play or to do a dramatic rendering of a scene is a whole different thing than the sort of wandering narrative of nonfiction. It's with all its loose strings and things they're not all the perfect stories, and then I watch how she does it, and it's kind of amazing. It's been a great experience.
Well, I think you did a wonderful job in your book of unearthing not just the stories of these women, but the interpersonal dynamics in this group, because as you said, each of the women was very different and had a different role among their escapees.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I had to wrestle with early on, because like I said, originally I wanted to write an essay, and I thought it would be just a pure kind of historical essay about this route and what happened. Then as I started to interview and delve into and find out more, and I really wanted to flesh out the story, I had to struggle with this. This question about, can I invent dialogue for them? Can I flesh out what and I struggled with that as a kind of a moral question. Am I a fiction writer? Am I a nonfiction writer? What am I doing here? And I guess I came to the conclusion, I know I came to the conclusion that because these women were, and as so many women, are kind of on the margins of the archive. You know, they're not really, you look at their military records, which I have, and they're very slender compared to similar agents that are men, you know, that did even less than they did. So there's not a lot has been recorded about them that can, you know, if I'm writing about de Gaulle or even Geneviève de Gaulle, there is a huge record, there's an archive, there's a way to, you know, but for these kind of women, I felt like in order to make them come alive on the page and to make them matter in a way, I had to let myself, you know, think really deeply and, you know, about how would they speak to each other. And of course, when I interviewed their descendants, I really asked those kind of questions. And when I read anything that they'd written, I really tried to focus on like their voice, and just so that I could, in some ways, with my imagination, bring their story, give their story more life. I felt I owed it to them.
Well, reading the book, the reader has a real sense of being there in that time, not in a hokey way, but in an authentic way, that it feels as if you really did your homework in reconstructing this as much as you could. So did you actually walk or trace the route of the women?
Yeah, I did it twice. And I did it the first time with my daughter, who was the same age pretty much that Hélène had been when Hélène had joined the resistance. And that was right in 2017. And it was right after Charlottesville, the neo-Nazi marching in Charlottesville. So she and I were kind of having this intense conversation with each other about the future and, you know, America, and then at the same time trying to do this route together. And it was really interesting because, you know, in some ways my daughter was really, you know, animated and kind of, and I was trying to stay patient, stay calm, you know, it's not the end of the world. And then I realized, like, you know, these women, when they were arrested, they were considered terrorists. That was their charge, you know, and they were really young, and they had that kind of urgency that my daughter and her friends have about the future of the world and their country and everything. So it was a really interesting trip for me with her, just the conversation between her and I as we did this. And it was also then, it ended, we did the walk and we ended in Buchenwald, because at the time, I thought the women had been in Buchenwald because that's what several of them wrote in their accounts. But they were wrong because they didn't understand the way the administration of the camps worked. They never were in Buchenwald. But the labor camp they went to was a sub-camp of Buchenwald for all kinds of complicated reasons. So anyway, we went to Buchenwald, and that was the end of this of walking their trail, or not walking, but tracing their trail. And that was the first time I had ever visited a concentration camp. And it was the first time Sophie had ever been to a concentration camp, my daughter. And so the two of us were just stunned. I mean, really, it was just a life-changing experience. I think it was at that moment that I realized, like, oh, I can't just write a simple essay. You know, I need to know this story. This is a story that has so much importance to it. I can't just, you know, I don't know, wing it. You know what I mean? It has to be really, I have to know the whole story. And it was also
at this point, none of the women were still alive, right?
No, none of the women were still alive, and I didn't know who the women were. I mean, at this point, I only knew Hélène and Lon. Hélène and Zaza. I mean, I hadn't identified who they were. Oh, I'm sorry. I knew Hélène, Lon, and Zaza, but I didn't know who the other women were in the group.
So I knew their first names. Their nicknames or their resistance.
Right, their nom de guerre, right, that had been in Zaza's book, but she didn't give their last names.
How did you figure out who these people were? I mean, they were long gone.
Yeah, it was the whole thing. I mean, it was complicated. Well, one of the things that happened was when I went to the Leipzig Memorial Labor Camp. There's a little museum there where they were in forced labor there for 9 months. And so there was a little museum. I went there and I talked to the archivist. I mentioned my aunt, and she said, I'll see what I can find. And a few days later, she emailed me this Nazi list. And there was my aunt's name on the list, and on that same list was Zaza, and on that list was Lon, and on that list was Gigi, and suddenly, Guillemette, and I figured Guillemette must be Gigi. And, you know, so then I started to figure out a few and right next to them was someone named Jose, and I was like, could that be the Jose they're talking about? And then, you know, that list was the beginning, and then interviewing the families and looking through, you know, just all the different archives I could find and reading the books. I found Zinka kind of weirdly through Lise London's book and through finally through Lon's book. But it was you know, it was a complicated, it was detective work, but it was actually really fun. I love that. Like, if I could just do that if I could have another life as a private detective, I think I would love it, you know, because it was, I would think I had the person. I'm like, I think I know now who. For a long time, I thought Jose was someone else. This woman named Maria, another Spaniard in the camp, and I had learned all about her family, her whole life. And then one day I found a critical piece of information that meant it couldn't possibly be Jose. So then I suddenly was, okay, back to the who could it have been, you know, who was she? But that was actually really fun. I went to the archives, I went to the National Archives, and I went to the military archives at Vincennes, and a bunch of different archives. I wrote to, there's there's a great German archive of Nazi records. So I wrote, and I got all the records for Hélène and for Suzanne from them, you know, that kind of thing. It was a whole discovery for me. The archives were a whole new world I didn't even know about. It was so great. Really
Another
fun.
interesting part of the book for me was the period after the war. So when they get through the battle lines of the war, I mean, that's an amazing part because there are bullets whizzing by.
Yeah.
There are landmines. There is a river they have to cross. There's
Yeah.
so many obstacles. And then they finally get to the other side, and things are not that easy for the women when they get to
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, going home was hard. It gave me a kind of empathy that I'd never had before or never completely understood for soldiers going home after the war. One of the things is that they were a really tight-knit group of friends at that point, and they had depended on each other for their lives, and they would in some ways never experience that closeness again. So there was a certain kind of loneliness that hit them when they went home, which is ironic. You know, it's a little bit like starving people talking about food. They're finally at home amongst their family and friends, and they felt profoundly lonely because they felt that no one could understand or actually see what they had been through. And they had to, you know, I think they tried some more successfully than others to just carry on and, you know, put that behind them. So going home was very difficult. And also it depended on the group. I mean, there were people who went home to nothing. They had no job, they had no place to live, they had no, you know, their whole families had been destroyed. And then there were, you know, people who went home and their mother said, you know, don't talk about it. I don't want to hear about it. What you've caused me so much trouble, this resistance of yours. Look what a mess it put you in. We'll never speak about it again, you know. So they had all kinds of different psychological problems. And I think one of the great things that happened after the war amongst some of the women, people like Lise London and Nicole, I think, formed these groups called the Amicale, which were the support groups that came after the war. So like survivors of Ravensbrück created an Amicale, and they created these groups, and they helped each other. They stayed with each other. A lot of them died quite soon after the war from the ailments that they had, and they stayed with each other. They made sure that there was always someone with them so the person wouldn't die alone. They felt that was incredibly important. So there's stories of the few years after the war, these women who, you know, were not going to make it for very long, had 24 hours, one of the survivors, they would take, you know, turns, and they would sit by her bedside so that she would never be alone dying. They, you know, they wrote their accounts to each other. They had a newsletter called Voix Visage, which became kind of a really important historical archive because, you know, in the 80s, Holocaust deniers started to come, and these women had this record that they had been keeping of what they had witnessed, and it was that was actually then in the 80s that a lot of the women started to speak up. They were so enraged. They were enraged because they thought of all their friends who had died, and they didn't want them to have died in vain. and to have their deaths be erased and, minimized.
I mean,
So
that was in a way a kind of beginning of the alternate truth or alternate reality that we're
yeah,
experiencing now, where people will deny the most obvious things that we've
big
seen.
obvious things. Yeah, there was a very famous Frenchman who said the gas ovens were only for lice. They were just light, killing lice. And he said that there were no gas chambers in Ravensbrück, and that there was, he said all these things. And I think that was actually, that woke up a lot of the women who had kept quiet. And that was sort of around when they were approaching the end of their lives. They were in their 60s, 70s, and 80s, and they started to then really speak up. In fact, I was going to say, because you asked earlier, I went, the first time with my daughter, and then the next time I traced the route really completely with my sister. But in between that, I took a trip with one of these amicales. It's the amicale for Buchenwald and the Commando. So every year they do a trip to the camp, to Buchenwald, and then to be there for the anniversary of the liberation, because actually Buchenwald is one of the camps that liberated themselves. And they have a big ceremony there every year in April. And then you also visit some of the satellite commandos, labor camps around there. And I went, so it's organized by this amicale, and I went, and it was all families of survivors. Everyone. There was a woman whose father had died, and there was a young man whose grandfather was. There were, and the two guides had lost their fathers in the camps, and they had been leading these groups since the 70s. These trips every year, and it had been at the beginning thousands of survivors. It was a pilgrimage. They would rent a whole train, a whole SNCF train, because this is Eastern Europe at that point, East Germany. And they would take these survivors to see these camps. But they told me, when I went, the last survivor had gone 2 years earlier, and that was his last time. But that was an incredible experience. For me, that was an incredible experience, because what I learned was that this was important to carry on bearing witness, this kind of passing of the torch to remember, because I wasn't sure at first whether these places mattered. And when I went with that group that time, I realized how deeply important it is. Yeah. I think I've gotten off topic again, but I forgot what we were talking about. But,
that's all part of the background of this.
Okay.
Important information.
Maybe yeah,
the participants, if they would like to ask questions, if you want to start putting questions in the chat, please do. Gwen and I will talk while you're writing. Are there already questions that?
I don't know. I was just looking. Yeah. So I think the other thing about that I really learned about for me in researching the book about after the war was this idea of transgenerational trauma, which I didn't understand, as a thing actually. And but then I met some of the family members, and they were able to tell me stories, and I realized, these trauma. Well, exactly like what I was saying earlier, the thing about Zinka and her son becoming an anorexic because his mother was an anorexic, and then he actually got tuberculosis, and his mother had tuberculosis, and it was like this kind of echo. And then his son is a chef who I met, who said, "I'm just trying to heal the wounds of my family." You can really you can follow the wound through the generations. So how did you deal with the mountains of research? Maybe not as well as I should have, but I had all kinds of note cards. I'm kind of old fashioned. I had a big cork board, and I had files, so there would be different topics, like transgenerational trauma, the books that I would read on that, and I'd take notes, and had pretty complex notes with page numbers and where referenced. And then I had a corkboard that had each of the women and the notes about them, what they did, and then because each of the women were in a different network and a different resistance network, so I did research on each of the different networks that they worked in, and then just Sometimes though, I couldn't find, I knew I'd read something somewhere and I would spend the whole day trying to find it. So I might not be the best, but I had files and folders and cork boards and yeah. And I also, at one point, I had a residency at the Vermont Studio Center, which was brilliant. And because I run a residency program, but I've never been to one. It was just so great. It was lovely.
Yeah.
I couldn't have finished the book if I hadn't had that. And there I was able to I color coordinated the different threads of the art, the different narrative arcs in a kind of annotated way and spread it out on the walls so that I could see, structurally what I needed to do and where I needed to fill in the gaps.
There's another question in the Q&A. Can you see the Q&A?
Okay, let me see.
On the lower right.
Yeah, I think the most gendered resistant analysis always seems to undervalue and underreport female resistance. Yes, I think that's actually very true. I think it might be changing now. I think there's more of a light being shown on women in the resistance in World War II. But what I also really feel, and this I came to reading about Ravensbrück and also the story of the women in Berlin as the war was ending. What is the brunt of the burden of war on women? That women, and that's definitely underreported, like what women actually go through. There's this kind of myth that the woman's at home like Penelope waiting for the warrior to return. And in fact, no, the woman is in the battlefield. They are under bombardment. They are, being raped. They are trying to find food for their children. They are, working in resistance cells. Women are in the war as much as the men are in the war. And that part of the story, people didn't want to know, and they didn't want to hear that. And so that's also part of the way that what women experienced, I think, was underreported. Even women were censoring themselves. I mean, Nicole wrote one of the documentary filmmakers showed this to me. Nicole wrote an essay about her experience for Elle magazine, where she was an editor. It was 20 years after the liberation, and she told the story of her deportation and her escape. And she got a letter from a fellow survivor that was excoriating. It was basically saying, how dare you talk about this? How dare you bring up this? This is like showboating and showing off, and we just need to be quiet. And, think of all the women who died. How dare you stand, and take any kind of, glory. Of course, Nicole was just trying to bear witness, but that was part of so that's also part of the silencing of women. It's done by everyone, not just men.
I don't know if you saw this question from Jacqueline Bishop, but she said, Gwen, I really appreciated your discussion on food and food culture and the books and recipes that the women made. I wondered if you came across similar bonding regarding needlework and sewing among the women.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. Thank you, Jacqueline. That's a great question. In fact, there's many accounts, but there was a whole group in women in the resistance who were from haute couture, from the high fashion, and they were in the camps. They were in Ravensbrück, and they were amazing sewers, and they made things out of nothing. And then a group of them were also sent to Leipzig, where our women were, the 9 were. And for St. Catherine's Day, there's a tradition this is just one example, but there were many. There's a tradition or there was, I think it's died out now, but in the haute couture world, that on St. Catherine's Day, they would make these incredible hats that unmarried women would wear. And then they would dance around with the hat. And it's an old folk tradition that had died out, but the haute couture women had kept it alive in Paris. And if you Google St. Catherine's Day hats, you're going to see some crazy hats. So the women in Leipzig did this. They did a St. Catherine's Day. They made hats for all the unmarried women in the French bloc, but they made crazy hats. I've read about this account in so many books because it was such an astonishing thing. Even in Russian, translated accounts. They made an Eiffel Tower. They made a hat that had a bird in a cage. And if you can imagine, they had nothing. I mean, they would, to get thread, they would undo the sacking that was the cover of their mattress to make something to sew things together with. They would tear little bits of leather off their shoes. They would pick up wire. They just created this incredible, you know, apparently it was just unbelievable. And Mena talks about how she learned sewing from these women in the camp, and that she, after the war, she made from the coat that she wore. It was a very cold winter, and so from that coat that she wore during the whole time and through her escape, she made a coat for her daughter, and then she later made a teddy bear. And the women made little toys for their children. And Mena made a little dog for a little stuffed dog for Zinka's daughter, and Lise London had some toys that she had made for her children, you know, in the hope that one day they would see their children again. So they were and Zaza knitted socks out of a pair of underwear for her, and then so over and over again I heard about how important. And in fact, at one point, Ellen kept wanting to escape. This is before, and she kept wanting Zaza to escape with her. And at one point, Zaza said, "Why don't you just go without me?" And Ellen said, "I can't. You have the needle and thread," because Zaza had managed to steal a needle and a needle. So yeah, sewing and needlework was essential, and it was a huge survival tool for them.
There's another question. Did you feel yourself closer to any of the women than others? Did you have a different, quote, relationship in a way with the various women?
I did. It's a good question. You know, obviously the one I knew and that I spoke with and I knew from my family was Hélène, but she was kind of a regal person and a little bit aloof and somewhat intimidating. I mean, she spoke 5 languages. She was a mathematician and an engineer. And I think the one that I ended up finding the most like feeling kind of closest to is Mena, who was Yvonne, because she's a city girl from the country. She had moved from Breton, and she has this kind, she just wants to be in love. And she even says, "I joined the resistance because I fell in love with a boy." I mean, she has this kind of way about her that I feel like if I'd known her, I would have really liked her. You know, I could relate to her. She was a very sort of poetic person and romantic, and I think she was a lovely person. She became very close with Gigi, who is another one who I think was sort of a calm and serene person. So yeah, I mean, I got quite felt affection for the different ones. As certainly when I spoke with their families and they described them to me, I mean, when I saw photos of them, I felt really close to different ones.
There's another question. During your research, did you come up against any resistance to your lines of inquiry?
You know, I was surprised. I was shy about contacting the families, and it would take me days. I would like write a letter, and then I'd go get a cup of coffee. I mean, I just was scared. I don't know. And they were all so great, all of them except for the only family that was not difficult, but that I didn't actually end up being able to talk with was José's family. That's a big regret I have. But the others were so nice. All of the families of the women were incredibly generous with photographs, generous with their time, happy to talk about it, interested. Some of them didn't know the story, so they were really happy to learn it. And that was also kind of powerful. Some of them, they often said, "Oh, we don't know anything." And then once you start talking to them, they actually did know quite a bit, little bits and pieces and details. Yeah, I mean, I ran into a teeny bit of resistance with, well, the very distant family of José never got back to me. And then I had to finish the book and I had to turn the manuscript. I wish I had another year, and I think I would have been able to find more about her. I feel that she was someone I wish I knew more about. Any other questions?
There's a question. Can you tell me more about the escape? We don't want to give too many spoilers.
I don't want to give a spoiler. Yeah.
There are some very suspenseful moments in this book.
You mentioned the village with shoes. Yeah.
Can you tell us more about how can you buy the book? Well, first of all, the book is called The Nine by Gwen Strauss.
Oh yeah, I'll show a cover at the end.
Yes, please.
And you can get it everywhere, but I really encourage everyone to try your local bookstore. That's the one you can obviously order it on Amazon and everything, but it's available at most local bookstores. If you ask them, they can order it for you.
Published by St. Martin's Press.
St. Martin's Press, yeah. I had a great editor there, Elizabeth Disregard. Someone asked, and you mentioned that the villagers would choose a woman to be called a collaborator, a head chef, etc. Do you mean they would choose a woman whether she had been a collaborator or not? No, yeah, I misspoke that. So it would be a young woman often. Sometimes she had only maybe washed the laundry of a German soldier or had housed him in her. Often it was widows or unmarried women. They often had no choice. They were, in a precarious position, and if a German officer or soldier in their village said that he was going to be staying at their house, they couldn't say no. The women that were chosen, I think it's kind of a typical, it reminds me of the witch trials of earlier times of the medieval period, because it was the vulnerable, the marginal, there were a lot of widowed women at that point from World War I and then World War II. And a lot of the collaborators, the really big collaborators, the men who made a huge amount of money on the black market in stolen food and black market goods and everything, nothing happened to them. And they were very well known. So they weren't, they weren't really called to account for really profiting. But, a lot of young women were. And it was kind of this interesting, I think that the French wanted to blame the women for their humiliation in the war. Just as Pétain had said that the reason that the French had lost was because the loose morals of women had led to their defeat. I think that after the war, there was a similar kind of like the female body, the vulnerable female body is where we will locate the crime, So that's what I meant by they would choose a woman. But sometimes the woman had slept with a German. Sometimes the woman had a child by a German, and those children would continue to be scapegoated for the rest of their lives. So, sometimes they were raped. You can imagine, how much agency a young or widowed woman would have at that point. And it's also important to remember that the women in France got the right to vote in 1944, a year before the end of the war. So they hadn't even had the right to vote up until that point. When all of these women joined the resistance, they had no rights.
That was very surprising to me, reading about that in the book, because I think of France as being one of the centers of feminism, with all the great women writers Francis had,
right,
the political activists Francis had, and there was no vote for women until
because it was I think it's a very Catholic country still. I don't know. I'm just making a conjecture, but there was still that kind of separation of the the women in the church and all kind of. And I think what was interesting for me too, just in that same thread of the revolutionary, is that the children of the survivors basically come of age and come of revolutionary age in 1968. And over and over again, when I would speak to the children of the survivors, they would say, well, when they would talk about what they did in 68, which was they were doing some kind of rebellion, like the son of Zinka, who had tuberculosis, was sent to a sanitarium where he then organized a hunger strike, of TB patients. And I said to him, like, you're crazy. Like, and he said, I couldn't help it. I'm a child of 68. And like a light bulb went off in my head, like, oh, it's exactly a generation later. And they're, expressing that same ferocious fighting back.
Well, there was a very striking moment during the demonstrations in 1968 where Daniel Cohn-Bendit, who was one of the inspirers, I don't want to call him a leader because he was an anarchist, but he was one of the inspirers of the movement in 1968, was from a German Jewish family, although he was French. And de Gaulle notoriously said, he's only a German Jew. And then people demonstrated in the streets of Paris with signs that said, nous sommes tous des juifs allemands, we're all German Jews. So the echoes of the war continued during that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I think that's maybe Should I share the cover of my?
Yes,
of my-
please.
You know, I actually realized I didn't get it set up beforehand, so this might be a little clunky, but I'm gonna do it. Let's see, how do I do this? Wait a second. That won't work. Here. I have to do this. Okay. Sorry, everybody. Because I have to find it. Here it is. I should have had it open before.
There's one more question I
Okay.
don't think you got to, which is, how did you separate your personal feelings from your duties as a nonfiction author? Was there a bleed, in quotes?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think that was also one of the processes of rewriting, and also the process of having a good editor, because I probably put everything into the 50th draft of the book when I turned in my manuscript, which was, 450 pages and way too long. And I had a lot of, feelings about all of these people that I really wanted to write more about. There's a lot that was cut out of the book. Huge section about Marie-Madeleine Fourcade, for example. A huge section about Odette Pidepol, who I didn't even speak about tonight. But and I really loved these people. I had read books and research and everything. Luckily, I had a very good editor who helped me realize, when to cut that out and to keep the story moving forward. And so maybe sometimes it takes someone else to help you do that. I don't know. The process of writing, it's a lot of rewriting and then a good editor. I think I was really lucky. I felt really grateful to her, and then also the copy editor was excellent, and so it's a you see at the end, it's a kind of a team. And also I have to mention I worked with a historian, Agnès Trebel, who read the manuscript and gave me exhaustive notes about. We really struggle with some of the terminology and what to call, to not use the sort of racist terms, and how to deal with some of the language, So all of that helped a lot, if that answers the question. I'm going to share the screen. So here's the cover. I think many people have already seen this. Can everyone see it now?
Yes.
Okay.
And Gwen, thank you so much for this wonderful information and stories of your composing this moving and gripping book. And I hope everyone will have a chance to read it.
Well, thank you, Zach, and thank you everyone for coming. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate all the comments and questions. And
someone asked, is the book translated into French?
No, it's not. We've sold it to, like I said, 12 countries, and not France or Germany.
Interesting.
Yes, Tom, I see your book. A Woman in Berlin was an important part of my book. Absolutely. I just saw your question. I read that book, and I talk about it in my book, actually. And I think it's a brilliant book. She's also a little bit complicated because she was a Nazi, it turns out. So you know what, Tom, I'm gonna have to see you. We'll have to talk about it together.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for attending, and Gwen, thank you so much for your.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you, Zach.